Hi, Misha here, and we're going to look at kind of a unique aircraft used by Britain in World War II. This is the Bristol Beaufighter, and kind of unique for the 1/72 scale diecast. This model is actually from Hobbymaster, not Corgi, but we will get to a Corgi model, the Mishaco, in the next video. The Beaufighter is kind of a jack-of-all-trades plane with a very interesting history through World War II. This really began in 1938 after the Munich crisis, when Bristol felt that the RAF could use a long-range heavy fighter that could deliver a payload, a punch. At the time, the RAF really didn't have a requirement for this, but Bristol already started working on converting their earlier Beaufort light bomber. And then in November of '38, the RAF kind of issued the initial specifications. And really by July of '39, the prototype, the Type 156 as the company called it, which became the Beaufort, first flew. Now this was an unarmed prototype. It had 2 Hercules engines and reached a max speed of about 335 miles per hour, so it wasn't a speed demon, but it was acceptable. And basically they just were able to get it in production, or at least a prototype ready, in 8 months, only because they were starting with the Beaufort. They more or less took out the bomb bay, and they replaced the rear turret position with a navigator. The next prototype, which was armed, flew in July of 1940. And already before that, the Air Ministry had ordered 300 of these before it was really completely ready to go. But that started off production. And the first started to see squadron service in September of 1940. So right in the middle of the Battle of Britain. And quickly this became paired with a new invention, the radar. Originally the so-called Beaufighter was not equipped with radar, but by November of that year, squadrons were adding the airborne radar sets to these, and by January of 1941 they were coming from the factory with radar installed. And that was a good fit for this, even though it was meant originally as a daytime heavy fighter. This nose, which originally had part of the bomb bay, had plenty of space for radar. Back then radar were quite large, airborne radar, so you needed a large fighter. And so very quickly this became used as a night fighter, replacing older designs like the Balton Paul Defiant. And it was well armed. It had 4 20mm cannon in the fuselage, and it had 6 .303 machine guns in the wings. Now interestingly, one wing had 2, the other wing had 4, so it was kind of asymmetrical. And the rear position for the navigator would double as the radar operator. And this could carry a small external bomb load of a couple of 220-pound bombs, so nothing crazy, but it could carry a couple of bombs. By December of 1940, they had made 100 of these, and by May of 1941, they had made 200. And they would start production at a second Bristol facility, as well as in Canada. And then in 1942-43, Australia would decide to make the Beaufighter under license. They had already made the Beaufort, so it made sense. So we'd eventually see Australian-produced versions. So this was used as kind of a daytime strike fighter, intruder, and a nighttime interceptor. Originally it was by the RAF. In 1941, the Royal Navy and Coastal Command would start to get versions of the Beaufighter as well. And this would see a lot of combat throughout the war. 1942, these would start to go over to the Pacific and be used against the Japanese. And they would be used pretty extensively in the Mediterranean, North Africa. They were even used over Europe. They're in a couple of pretty famous raids. They would, of course, continue to upgrade these. Soon they would have versions capable of mounting up to 8 rockets, unguided rockets. Coastal Command Navy would also develop a version that could carry a torpedo, nicknamed the Torbo. So this could carry a torpedo. They would also try a few different engines. One thing, the RAF, this was originally, like I said, made for the Hercules engine. The RAF, the Air Ministry wanted it to also be able to take the Griffin engine. And then, when there was a shortage of Hercules, they tried, and they even made about a few hundred of these with Merlin engines, but those had some issues. But you'll see some differences, like the Mark I versus Mark II will be Hercules versus Merlin. This was given a priority during the war, so these were produced quite rapidly. In fact, Britain would continue making the Beaufighter until September of 45, and Australia would make it until 1946. And just under 6,000 of these would be produced in total. Now, in the night fighting role, it would start to be supplanted by the Mosquito in 1942, and by 43 there were enough night-equipped Mosquitoes to take over for the Beaufighter. So, really these would be taken out of night service before D-Day, but they would be employed as strike aircraft against ground targets. And they were actually very successful maritime vessels. They would have maritime radar installed. They would be credited with sinking basically half of the total tonnage during the war, which was about 117 vessels. So they were actually quite successful as torpedo and dive bombers against enemy vessels. They were also good strafers with up to 10 guns on board. The only real downside, they were slow, somewhere between 310 and 330 miles per hour armed up, and they had a relatively low ceiling of under 20,000 feet. But I mean, what do you expect from a 2-engine design? They were durable, they were reliable, they were sturdy, because it was kind of based off an original design that had already been tried and tested. The only real thing is that their handling upon takeoff and landing was less than desirable. They were a little difficult, tricky to land sometimes, and they didn't like to fly on one engine. They really needed both engines, so it could fly on one engine, but it just wasn't always great. But it's a pretty important fighter for the war, and one you don't hear a lot about, so I thought I'd just do a little video. These would remain in RAF service through the 50s as target tugs as well as trainers. They actually weren't retired out completely until 1960, so they outlived a lot of their World War II contemporaries because it was a versatile plane. If not technologically all that remarkable, at least it did have some very good aspects. And it's worth talking about. Like I said, this model is from Hobby Master. It's typical Hobby Master quality. You've got the crew figures that can be removed, canopies, gear up or down. Relatively simple, but, you know, mostly metal body. This is an RAF fighter version. Like I said, there's also the Coastal Command variants. There's a whole series made for them that were specialized for their needs. But, yeah. This one did come from Pete's Collectibles. He had a couple of these left, so I grabbed one when I was doing my British thing. I'm glad I did. It's a nice big plane. The original one was a little over 41 feet long with a wingspan of just under 58 feet. So even in 1/72 scale, this is not a small plane. Well, that was just an overview. There's actually a lot to know about the Bristol Beaufighter, so if you're interested, I encourage you to research it. Pretty neat plane. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.